The county Bible opened where it should not. The leather cracked. The cord groaned. A pressed cedar sprig lay there, as if someone had tried to make the smell do the work of mercy. Under it a bond blistered from heat. Melted wax shone like a small lake at dusk. 2 names written by the same hand where 2 hands should have disagreed. The date was good. The degrees were not. In the same breath, where the Lord was called witness, a family unstitched its own bones and called the unpicking a marriage. They did it by lantern. They did it in a kitchen where the rafters had learned to keep confidences. A traveling man with a Bible and a coat too thin for the ridge weather stood in the doorway with his hat crushed in his fist and the smell of river on him. He did not ask the question men should ask when names sit too close together on a page. He warmed his hands and looked at the elder matron once and looked away. He tied 2 knots where none should have been tied at all. 2 brothers took their mother's sisters as wives. The ink trembled as if the letters knew they had been forced to stand in the wrong places. Something in the room pulled back from what had been done. The kettle stopped its small singing and would not begin again. The bread gave no smell. The clock counted without heart. The elder matron kept her hands wrapped in a shawl, though no cold lived there. She put a thumb on the cedar sprig, as if scent could push a sin into a page and nail it there. The clerk's ledger shows the first wound without admitting it. A smear where the degrees of kindred should be set down. A straight line of ink that is not a line at all, but a finger pulled across wet writing with intent. The next column holds witness marks. The marks look too alike. The same way a man draws when he is in a hurry or when fear is heavy on the wrist, and the hand cannot make itself different. In the preacher's little journal, a night is missing. The cord shows where a leaf was torn out. The texture of the paper around it goes rough. Ink shadow bleeds through to the page that follows with just enough ghosts to make out the shapes a man tried to forget. There is a loop where the first letter of a name began and no name after it. There is a line where he writes the word mercy and then stops and draws his pen across the word until the word is gone and only the ground beneath it remains. Stay with me. Subscribe if you dare to uncover more forgotten tragedies. We will not be kind here. The fields were not kind. The paper was not kind. There is a reason a secret like this learned to bury itself and learned to grow like something planted too deep. By the next harvest a small mound rose at the fence line, where the family ground gave against the road right. No stone, cedar sticks tied with cloth. Soil that looked too new for fall. The sound in the yard changed after that. The wind found ways to move around the house without touching the house at all. Goats balked at the gate and pressed their heads against the slats and bawled without want. Chickens lost count of light and scratched the same circle until it showed wood under dirt. A woman's hand in the household book writes 2 names, then scrapes them away. The page feathers under her palm. She presses harder. The scrape goes through. The next page wears the scar of a thing that wanted not to exist and was given only a thinner place to live. But why did this happen? And why was it erased from history? There was a hush in the valley after the vows. That is one way to tell it. As if the hills themselves held their breath around the house and waited to hear if the people inside would learn how to breathe without the old order. The brothers stopped singing in the yard. They stopped talking to one another with their faces. They took to sleeping in places where no bed had ever been meant to stand. Smokehouse. Barn. Under the wagon in good weather. The sisters ate at different tables. The elder matron set her chair in the doorway each evening and stared past everything, as if waiting for something to come up the road she had not invited. They nailed a chest in the loft and used 3 locks that did not match. The hired hand who saw it quit without reaching for his pay. He left his hat. He did not return for it. He spoke to no one about the chest. He told his dog not to walk under that roof. He moved across the creek and built a smaller room for himself and kept the door open even at night until winter made him choose between cold and fear. Word went out and did not go out. That is how things travel where the river teaches men to keep their mouths shut. On court day men spit near the steps and measured one another without looking. Women bought needles by the paper and said nothing about daughters. The preacher who tore a page came back by day to ask for a tithe. The elder matron met him at the yard line and spoke to him in a voice that anyone would have thought belonged to a man who had done hard work in weather for many years. He lifted his hand to touch his mouth and found he could not. By spring smoke crept from under the house while the hearth upstairs was cold. A cradle stood under the walnut tree a full day and a night. Hogs moved in the yard and would not pass it. A neighbor's boy came to the fence and watched and walked home. Without running, though, a dog followed with teeth showing. He kept that pace because his father had told him that when a yard looks at you across a fence, you do not give it your back, and you do not give it haste. You give it the way you would walk through a graveyard. Each step measured. Each breath counted. The water at the spring turned to pennies. That is the closest word men could find for it. As if copper had melted there and threaded itself through the limestone, they hauled the water and boiled it and burned more wood than a family can afford when winter hangs on. The taste did not leave. The elders sat in the shade at the split rail and said milk sickness, and nodded with the kind of nod men use when a thing does not convince them and must be agreed to anyway. A grandmother's sampler disappeared from the parlor wall. No one admitted taking it down. A square of darker plaster behind it showed where it had been. The women were asked about it in the language that sounds like asking and is actually telling. The elder matron said she had turned it over and set it in a trunk because it had too many names on it now and made the room feel crowded. She did not open the trunk to prove it. When she died, the trunk was opened and nothing of thread lay there, but a square of linen cut from a dress did. 2 stitches at the corner did not match. If you stand at the edge of the yard in that hollow and turn your back to the house and look at the road, you will understand the place where the first mound lay. The fence separates the living ground from the state's right, and law bends around this line and looks the other way when it can. That is where they set it. Not inside where it could be claimed, not outside where it could be corrected. Between. The sticks of cedar tied with cloth looked like a prayer and like a warning both. The prayer said, "Leave us this." The warning said, "Do not speak the names we cut away." In the church, a woman coughed at the wrong time when the passage of Ruth was read. The elder matron sat in her square pew and did not move. The line about kin and duty and harvest rolled out into the room, and nobody smiled the way they usually smiled when hearing a story they used to bless their seasons. A child giggled and was taken outside and did not come back in. The preacher looked at the window instead of his book during the last lines. He forgot to close the Bible before he stepped down and had to come back up and do it. The old women with their best hands kept their eyes on the elder matron and watched for a sign they had no right to want. Night carried a sound into that kitchen that men had no words for. The wasp nest torn open is one neighbor's phrase. Wind caught in a throat is another. When the midwife came in winter, she wrote blood too soon, and afterbirth too late, and the room went quiet the way it did in the fever year. She wrote that the child wore a veil. She would not say whether the child drew breath. She pressed her thumb into the wax to hold the page and left her print there deep as the remembered weight of a head on a lap. You can turn the county marriage book for that year in 2 places and find the cord cut where pages used to be. Someone worked the blade cleanly along the binding with the care a woman uses. When removing a hem, she is ashamed of sewing. In a second county, the same year is whole, but 2 lines aren't inked over with a wash. That was meant to be transparent, and is not. In a third, the book is whole, and yet does not carry names any of us can recall, and the hand that wrote looks like someone who had forgotten how to write, and was now trying to remember with a fist. They say a redbird refused that roof. That was the children's rhyme. 2 brothers wed and 2 sisters wept. The river turned back, and the corn would not set. The redbird would not make a nest on that roof. Children are cruel when they are made to keep their mouths closed, and hearsay likes to wear a bright feather. It is not the feather that matters. It is the part about corn that would not set. If you cut open an ear from that field, that season you find emptiness, where kernel should be in silk that had not learned how to thicken. Things planted too close do not always bear. Some things planted too close bear more than they should, and the bearing takes what is not offered. You can pretend this is only gossip, and Better Families Did Worse in Time has a way of making its own absolutions. Then you will find the docket slip in a folder in a courthouse, where 3 courthouses worth of paper were piled together after one burned. The slip calls a marriage improper, then throws the word away by scratching it so hard the paper thins. A better word was not written in its place. The clerk wrote only the initials of the names, as if ashamed to know them. Where the initials should point you toward real bodies, they point into a fog of cousins and aunts and mothers with the same given name in the same line, repeated until even the people who study such things lay their pens down. There is grief that comes of weather and grief that comes of law. The first teaches a house where to set its buckets and where to hang its coats and how to watch a river without blinking, because a river cheats when you look away. The second teaches a house to whisper in its own rooms and teaches children to keep careful faces in front of visitors and to never look at the 2 people to whom they are attached in the way that names might demand. This house learned both and then learned the third grief that is worse. The grief that a family gives itself for reasons it will not say aloud. I tell you this as if we had not been told to leave the matter in the field and let it rot there. I tell you this because paper is never only paper in a place like this. It is a living ground that tries to grow its way back to truth, even when fire has come through. There are singe marks on the marriage bond, where a candle tried to make the past obedient and failed. There are dried petals between pages, where the elder matron preserved small lives that either went away or never came. There is a smear on the entry where the bartender's cousin wrote the witness line, and the smear belongs to a tear or to a finger that had just pressed a mouth shut. You do not need a figure in black to lay a curse. You need only a house full of people who insist on bending the world to keep their plot neat. Then the land itself takes the insult and holds it. The limestone holds it. The spring holds it and tastes like pennies. The fence holds it and cannot keep dogs in. The road takes it to town and makes the merchants count slow, as if coin had learned to weigh itself differently. When the preacher came back a second time to demand what he called the Almighty's due, the elder matron rose from her chair and stepped to the yard line and told him he could have his due. When he could say her daughters' names in the order the Lord had meant for them, and could say them without gasping, he did not try. He left the yard and went home and looked at the page he had torn and put the page into the stove, and the page did not burn. He crumpled it and slid it into the crack behind a beam and spent the next week hearing it breathe. The first cedar sticks rotted. The cloth hung longer than anyone expected it to. It turned the color of rain that will not break. A man with a team and a wagon brought field stones and set them without letters. Children counted their steps between the stones as if measuring an invisible rope. The goat that had bawled itself sick went to the neighbor's pasture and learned a quieter call and came back one day and would not cross the line into the yard and lay down with its head between its legs like a creature waiting to be lifted and turned and released in a field far away. Do not ask me yet about law. Law lives here in bound books and in a place in the chest that is not bound at all. Blackstone would tell you degrees, and the cans would say which bed belongs to which house, and the minutes of the Baptist Association would speak of scandal and discipline. The books sat open on tables across the county, and men nodded over them and felt better, and went home and returned to their houses and shut the doors, and ate what their wives set there, and remembered how the elder matron's voice sounded when it came across the yard, and they remembered, too, the way hunger has of making a man decide which sin he can bear without breaking. We are not yet in the years. We are in the room where a lamp smokes and cedar smells, and a man with a traveling case pretends an ink smear is only an ink smear. We are in a kitchen where two brothers keep their eyes down, and two sisters hold their hands too still, and the elder matron counts her breath, and a shadow pushes itself into the corners, as if a shape decided to live there rather than in the yard. We are in a place where the first step into what will be called horror is only a step into a different kind of silence. The kind that follows a vow that should not have been spoken in any tongue. Stay with me. Subscribe if you dare to uncover more forgotten tragedies. The rest of this story lies in cellars and in ash, and in the gap between a scripture and a bond. It lies in two graves, just inside a fence, and in a sampler turned against a wall, and in a spring that kept tasting like pennies long after the cows had learned to graze a different slope. And it lies most of all in the paper that lived, and the paper that was cut out, and in the hands that trembled when they wrote what they wrote, and then tried to unwrite it with a blade. We will turn those pages. We will count the names that were erased. We will walk the yard where no redbird ever blessed the roof, and listen to the corn that would not set. Then we will ask the question again, and hear the hills answer in the only way hills can. With a hush that does not forgive, and does not forget, and does not let a secret remain a secret, once it has been spoken in lamplight. The year written on the barn doors and in the court minutes is 1832. Kentucky sits between a finished world and one still being built. Cane breaks thinning. Tobacco rows deepening. Limestone springs cutting clear veins through red clay. Town squares where the same men lean on the same rails on the same court day each month and spit in the dust, as if that were speech enough. A river that moves everything that should be forgotten toward Louisville and Cincinnati and brings back the things men claim they never asked for. The state pretends to be finished. The farms pretend to be settled. The paper tries to make it true. On the respectable surface, everything wears its Sunday. The cabin roof shines with fresh shingles that have not yet grayed. The yard is raked. Pigs do not wander the front path. A smokehouse smells of hickory and pride. Inside the house, a family Bible from Philadelphia lies open to a page titled Births and another titled Marriages and Deaths. Copperplate headings. Domestic hands filling the lines beneath. The book itself is a work of 2 centuries. Printed by a city printer who learned his trade from men who learned theirs before the Revolution. Bound in leather that has seen more storms than the people who keep it. Tucked into its back are things that do not belong to Scripture at all. A handbill from a camp meeting. A formula for killing weevils. A folded table of kindred and affinity copied from an older book and stitched at the edges by someone who wanted it never to slip free. Older books whisper from inside the newer ones. Blackstone rides across the Ohio in memory and in practice. His commentaries copied by men who never held the London originals. His rules none the softer for being spoken in frontier rooms. The degrees of kindred and affinity that the old Church of England set down when James still wore a crown appear here in rough script. Not the shape of ritual. The shape of lines that must not cross. Aunt and nephew forbidden. Sister and brother forbidden. Mother's sister and a man who shares that mother's blood forbidden, because the two are the same line bent into a circle. These tables do not travel as angels. They travel as habits. They come pinned inside Bibles and soon into the backs of almanacs and copied by men who read by tallow to prepare for court day. The Kentucky Gazette in the 90s of the last century printed the neatness people wanted. Banns entered. Bonds announced. Notice of impediments to be declared 3 times before a wedding. A column that praised a couple who kept to the letter of rule. Then the pioneer years crashed through and banns went thin. Bonds became the standard. A paper sheet with a printed form and wide spaces to be filled by names and amounts. A promise to pay if a lie had been told. A security to ensure no lawful impediment would shame a minister. Men signed and placed their names under sums that would sting if the truth came late. The form kept its tidy words, while the cabins around it learned new ways of keeping warm. Baptist associations spoke in a different tone. Minutes from the 1820s sit in clerks' chests and smell of smoke and damp and patience. They warn against scandal, and they warn against conformity to the world, and they warn with special ink about unions that would be a stumbling block to the flock. Nothing in those lines looks ready for horror. It is all warning written before anything in particular has happened. Everything set down to keep the river from entering the house. The river entered anyway. It is the nature of rivers to pretend they are invited. When a man lives by one long enough, he thinks like it. The law in Kentucky is a river that learned to wear shoes. It walks into parlors and speaks in the clear vowels of a commonwealth that stepped away from its mother, and says, we will keep your traditions, and we will keep your rules, and we will keep the parts of both that suit the men who sit on these steps. The order books of the county courts prove it. Turn their stiff pages. You find licenses for stills, notices of stray cattle, fines for fights, bonds for marriages, orders against vice. Now and then a line about degrees of kindred, and the names of people who forgot how to stand apart. This is the lay of the land into which the kitchen lamp burned on a night a traveling preacher paused at a door. A minister without a church can look like charity. He can also look like a tool. Kentucky knows both faces. The camp meetings that once shook the ridge told people that God would come through brush and into hearts, and it was true. The other thing they taught is that a word spoken under canvas at midnight can be used to flatten a rule the next day. Cane Ridge was thunder memory by 1832. Its echoes made men and women feel very close to right and very far from the old tables that told them which bed must never sit beside which hearth. The wheel with the prettier name spun as well. Improvement. The year before and the years after saw pamphlets that praised roads and canals and schools, and the domestic improvement that men insisted would make a place civilized. A handbill in the family Bible speaks both tongues. On one side, the notice of a meeting to support a new academy for girls who would keep their hands industrious and their thoughts uplifted. On the other, a reminder that parents must be vigilant over the company their young keep. It is always the company that does the harm, never the room, never the hour, never the names themselves. The respectable surface continues. Mothers lead charity baskets from cabin to cabin and keep a list in pencil of who gave and who took and who must be repaid when better weather returns. Fathers read aloud from Ruth during harvest. They read that a kinsman can redeem and that a field can be bought back and a name kept alive. They stop before the parts that trouble them. They do not wish to confuse mercy with law. They do not wish to give daughters ideas that might push against the tables tucked in the back of the book. The daughters stitch samplers with verses in cross. The letters line up. The borders crown the words in neat colors. The work is consolation, and it is ledger. It is a way to keep the names that matter in order without having to speak them in a crowded room where stones might listen. Court days pass. Neighbors weigh each other without weight. Men from the ridge drift down to the square and stand. As if pulled by a magnet, they pretend not to feel. A judge arrives on a slow horse, and pens created by town boys make him look important. He reads the docket in a tone that suggests nothing can surprise him. The docket surprises no one. Fences disputed. Bonds acknowledged. Minor offenses put to rest. In a corner a clerk writes a word no one wishes to hear. Affinity. The clerk knows what it means, and the judge knows what it means, and the man with the hat in his hands knows what it means, and not one of them says it out loud, because saying it out loud would give it a life it already has. The year itself has a pulse that the paper cannot stop. The second cholera will spill through the valley within a season. Another fever lurks in the berries and the milk and the small pools where cattle step, when the weather stays wet. The land carries curses and cures at once. Milk sickness rides a green plant that looks like something any ordinary wood should grow. White snakeroot. Cows eat it and carry death into the crocks of careful women. It takes patience to tell the difference between fate and fault in a place like this. People learn to blame the land when they cannot blame each other. Then they learn to blame each other when they cannot lift the land. The moral print keeps step with these weatherings. A Presbyterian pamphlet from 1830 warns that the frontier breeds strange couplings and urges fathers to carry copies of Blackstone in their pockets, as men used to carry shells of bullets. There is a painted diagram in a German primer printed in Pennsylvania that emigrants pack with them when they travel west. A little wheel showing forbidden lines, nothing more than dots and spokes. It is not a piety. It is a warning. It is meant to be looked at whenever the heart decides it has rights of its own. Domestic guides ride along with all this iron paper. Books that teach women how to turn lard into soap, how to keep linen white and hearts prayerful. Matthew Carey printed a book in Philadelphia that sits under a trivet in more than one Kentucky kitchen, and still the pages live. They whisper receipts and cures and admonitions to keep order in the house, so that nothing unclean can abide under the roof. They tell you to make your cellar dry. They do not tell you what to do when moisture rises from beneath a house for reasons that have no name yet in the family. They tell you to sweep dust and to keep away mice. They do not tell you how to keep away people who make a table into a place where lines cross that were never meant to. The county's Methodist circuit rider keeps a journal that belongs to all the houses at once. The pages are stained with loops of rain. He writes the pitch of each family, who sings loud and who sings honest, and who sings because it keeps the mouth from saying what it should not. He writes that the women of one hollow refused the invitation to a love feast because it had too much of a certain household in it. He writes that the revival near the creek brought the sinners 3 steps forward and sent the proud 2 steps back. He writes nothing of what happened in the kitchen where a lantern burned too long. His silence is offense. He may not even know why he built it. Across years you can watch the state teach itself manners on the page. Guardianship bonds for orphans. Apprenticeship papers signed with solemn hands that will soon put those hands to work. Notices of licenses being granted for men to keep taverns open late if they promise not to sell to the already drunk. Through all of this, the marriage bond sits like a trapdoor waiting for a foot that does not know the floor under it has been cut. The bond asks a simple thing, that men promise there is no impediment and pledge money against the chance that they have lied. The pledge is never money alone. It is reputation. It is the right to sit in the second pew instead of the back. It is the right to bury within fence and not outside the boundary where birds do not sing. In the shadows of these print places grow the older words. Words of kin that do not need a clerk. Names said around fires in winter when spinning wheels hum. Stories told of a great-grandmother who had to choose between a father's command and a lover's hand and chose neither, and ran and married in a county 2 days away. That story returns now as warning and as permission both. The same mouths speak it with the same breath. The children who listen learn both lessons. If you carry the breath of your mother, you are never free of her sisters, and if you carry the breath of your mother, you must be careful not to turn a story into a rule. Women keep a separate ledger without paper. Who watched who at the spring? Who blushed? Who did not and should have? Which man lingered at a gate not his own? Which girl moved her eyes wrong when the preacher came near? These marks are cut at the back of the mind. They shade every conversation. They salt every pot. They are not written down because they would burn if they were put to paper, and too many lives would refuse to rise again. The women look up from their work at the door, when a piece of news walks in wearing the coat of respectability, and shake their heads once, and keep their hands busy. The book of Ruth sits open often in the fall. It sings quietly to houses that need to believe there are clean ways to knit broken lines back together. It is not a book about permission. It is a book about famine. Men pretend otherwise. They take what they wish from it and leave the rest. The good fathers find the parts that tell them to take care. The loud ones find the parts that tell them control is a kind of love. The daughters who sit near the fire and ply their needles hear all of it and tuck it away with their threads. When men say the word America, they mean a place where they can move without asking those who were here before for leave. When they say the word Kentucky, they mean a place that chose to draft its own laws and keep the ones that made them feel they had not been unmade by leaving. When they say the word family, they mean a thing so sacred that it can justify any edge they wish to cross, as long as the whole appears to stand upright in the eyes of the square. Fold this all together, and you have the recipe for the kitchen, where the cedar sprig laid on paper, as if rating the air clean. There is always a courthouse first-bound volume that tells on the rest. Not the big names. The lines about a man fined for missing muster. The line about a woman presented for bearing a child without bonds. The line about a road admitted from one point to another. And the line about a marriage license granted on the oath of a brother. They look harmless because the clerk's hand is polite. You do not see the weather in the room. You do not hear the way someone breathed when the judge said granted. You do not smell the iron the spring brings when the water table is high. The respectable surface remains true enough to keep those who live on it from whipping off the cloth, and seeing the table they eat from is no longer level. A traveler passing through in that year writes in his memorandum book a sentence that holds the whole in its teeth. He says that Kentucky keeps one hand on a Bible and one hand on a rifle and puts its ear to the ground as if it expects to hear an answer from below. He says the people are generous and direct and fond of rules that bend for their kin and bend only once for a stranger. He notices nothing of the house at the mouth of the hollow, where the elder matron keeps her chair in a doorway and stares at the road. Some rooms hide well when the observer likes to be pleased. You must imagine the sound of the brush arbor rising at the edge of a field. Men cutting poles. Women bringing baskets. Children hauling pine boughs until the whole place smells like a tree that walked, shouting, crying. Prayers like thunder and whispers like bees. This is the other law, the one that reminds people they can start over. If the old tables on the back page of the Bible say no, and the arbor says mercy enough times in a night, the heart will decide to ignore one voice and follow the other. That is not a doctrine. It is a weather. In 1832, the weather moved through that county in equal parts heat and chill. The last calm thing, before the kitchen, became a place where horror would learn to speak softly, is the way the farm looked. When a stranger stopped his horse at the gate, the rows were straight. The rail fence mended in the last month. The barn paint held better on its north side. The woman who came to the door wiped her hands on her apron and asked what he needed with her head. Tipped in a way that suggested too much trouble, had recently asked for entry. There was nothing for a stranger to see. He could not smell the cedar lying flat in a Bible on a table inside. He could not see the ink that waited like a dead bee in a rim of wax. He could not hear the sound the kettle made when a certain subject entered the room. That is the respectable surface. It is not a lie. It is a layer. The law sits on it in neat pages that fold flat and are tied with ribbon on the days the clerk tidies his desk. The speeches sit on it. The hymns sit on it. The neighborly customs sit on it, and ask nothing, but that doors be shut when weather turns, and that no one use a neighbor's gate latch without permission. Beneath it the older rules breathe. The church tables copied from a century and a continent away. The frontier habit of doing as one pleases until someone makes a fuss. The practice of smoothing a wrong into a right, as long as the circle that benefits calls it survival and looks sad. It is enough to understand this frame to see why the night in the kitchen did not rip itself free of its time, but grew from it as a plant grows from the kind of ground that loves it. The brothers did not invent a sin. They chose a shadow already wandering among the cabins. The sisters did not invent silence. They accepted the tone that the room had taught their mouths. The elder matron did not invent a defiance. She wore the old country apron with the new country law tucked into it, and pulled it up when the wind rose from the direction of the court. The year turns slowly in such places. The season looks the same as the season before until a lamb is born with a mark, and an uncle speaks too tenderly to a niece, and a preacher loses a page, and a clerk uses his finger to smear a line that would not dry in time, and that smear outlives all of them. The rest is the work of drought and rain and memory, and the fact that paper does not forget even when men order it to be burned. The respectable surface has been laid. The meal is set. The guests have arrived. You can hear the clock. It does not know what it is counting toward. It believes it is counting toward Sunday. It is not. They chose a night when thunder kept its own counsel above the ridge. The kitchen wore its old skin, rafters dark with smoke, a table scarred by knives that had known only meat and rope. The elder matron sat with her hands in her shawl, as if she had hidden a small creature there, and hoped it would not move. A traveling preacher stood in the doorway, with his hat crushed and rain on his shoulders. He had the look of a man asked to bless a harvest that would not feed anyone he loved. 2 slips of paper lay on the table, licenses dated a day before the ink had dried, names entered clean enough, bondsmen signed. The place where degrees should be stated carried a pretty phrase that meant nothing. Lawful impediment none. He did not ask the question a sober man should. He warmed his hands on an empty kettle and then, as if the lamp hurried him, opened his book and began to speak the words that make a door, even when a house needs a wall. The brothers did not look at their mother. They stood like men who had chosen a road and could walk it only if they did not see the faces they passed. The sisters kept their hands on their aprons and pressed their fingers into the cloth, the way one presses a wound to staunch it. A witness line was filled later by a hand that drew 2 marks which looked like twins. The act wore a smile on paper. In the room the lamp leaned as if it wanted to lift away. He spoke and tied a knot, and then another, and the elder matron kept her eyes on the cedar sprig in the family Bible, as if scent itself could stop what scripture now helped along. Something in the kitchen leaned back from them all. The kettle stopped its tiny breath. A moth that had worried the lamp glass for an hour settled on the sill and did not stir. The preacher closed his book and held it as if a child slept within and could be dropped only once. Morning moved over the field as if it were ashamed to be seen there. The brothers walked separate paths to the spring so they would not fall into step. The sisters carried bread to the smokehouse as if the bread did not weigh anything. The elder matron followed the preacher to the gate and did not let him turn to wish her good day. She had no day for him. He stepped out into rain and did not look back. The clerk wrote what he had been told to write. 2 unions bound with no impediment declared. The names rode the page like mules that did not wish to enter water. There is a smear where the law should have spoken the word that would have stopped a hand. A mark pulled by a finger that could not stand to see the line dry neat. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Men who keep tramps' journals on circuit preach where they are asked, and hold their tongues when a stove shows the signs of last night. Yet this one tried. He wrote in his small book that a kitchen near the river held air that fought him. He wrote that mercy failed to carry in his mouth, that he wished for a greater authority and saw none nearby except the woman in the doorway who did not look at him, and yet sent him from the house with his hands empty. That page went missing later. A tear along the cord proves someone disliked the memory more than he disliked sin, but not everyone agreed on what really happened. Winter came and sat low on the ridge. The midwife was cold and wrote her small hand in her private ledger by candle on the mantel, while women moved in the bedclothes, and the house forgot how to breathe. Blood too soon. Afterbirth too late. The child wore a veil and would not stay. She wrote that quiet arrived as it had in the fever year, that the sound in the room changed into a hum, that lives in walls after shock has left flesh. She signed her name with ink that stuttered. She did not add the line some women add when they wish to save a family from its story. The wind was against it, but not everyone agreed on what really happened. The official entry called it mischance, and sent no man to ask what prayers had been said, or what prayers had been swallowed. The cemetery on the hill refused to speak a name. The yard took the mound instead. 2 sticks of cedar tied with cloth, and set just inside the fence, as if the family had asked the boundary to share the blame. A neighbor boy counted his steps between the road and the sticks, and told his mother how many. Next day he could not remember the number. He remembered only the smell of pennies at the spring, and the way the goats screamed without looking at anyone. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. There is a day in spring when smoke should rise only from a hearth that has seen breakfast. On that day it rose in a thin nerve from under the sill. The women were in the yard at the kettle, and the men were in the field, and the cradle stood under the walnut. Someone shouted. Everyone ran. They beat the stones where the smoke curled, and pulled boards and found no ember. The air under the house moved as if many small lungs had chosen that place to work. The cradle was lifted into the yard and left there for a night, and a day as if to cool the feeling that had gathered under it. Hogs circled and would not pass. A dog howled in a one note that belongs only to animal throats that understand what a house has done to itself. The sheriff wrote domestic dispute in his little book, and the book enjoyed how neat that looked. The neighbor's diary said the mother's sister ran barefoot in the rain with her hair loose and her mouth moving. The diary used neither witch nor mercy. It chose no word. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. By summer 2 mounds showed a foot apart near the fence. This time the cloth on the cedar hung like a question. A man from the church came on a hot day and spoke at the gate about proper burial, and about what a community owes even to infants, whose names were not spoken above breath. He left with a mark on his lip, and a voice that would not climb any higher than a whisper for a week after. He did not return to ask again. The county minute that recorded his complaint is missing. The cord shows where a leaf was pulled. Soot smudges the edge of the page before and after. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The kitchen learned a new geometry. The brothers slept in the smokehouse, and in the loft and under the wagon when weather allowed. The sisters ate at separate tables, and lifted their spoons without looking up. At night the elder matron set a chair in the doorway again, and held it there as if it were a piece of furniture that could prevent a second kind of weather from entering the room. A chest appeared in the loft, and was nailed shut, and held with 3 locks that were bought at 3 different fairs. The hired hand saw it, and left his pay on the sill, and carried only his shirt and his knife. He told his dog to come, and the dog did not. It stayed in the yard and howled. The hand did not return for the money. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Water at the spring will turn when iron touches it. This water tasted wrong without coin in it. The elders called it milk sickness by way of a path around blame. White snakeroot hides in shady patches and kills what it can reach through the cow. The sheen on the crock tells you when you have brought death home. The women watched their cream and found it wanting, and said nothing about the people who stirred in the night and looked out windows with no lamp lit. The men spoke the plant name and did not speak each other's names. The taste took months to leave. Then it did not leave at all, but not everyone agreed on what really happened. Children sang what adults forbade in the yard. 2 brothers wed and 2 sisters wept. The redbird would not nest on their roof. The corn would not set. The rhyme walked the hollow faster than any justice. It does not matter, it was unkind. Unkind rhymes are the only ones that stay. The elder matron stepped to the fence and the children ran. She did not move her hands. She had already moved too much. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. An old sampler fell from the parlor wall and was turned to face the wood. 2 stitches in one corner did not match the rest. A square of fabric cut from a dress lay in a trunk with 3 knots in one hem, where there should have been 2. A woman who visited to help with laundry set her palm on the turned sampler and told herself no more visits would be made. She visited again when the barn roof peeled and men shouted in rain. She carried water into the kitchen and put the bucket down and fled, and never remembered lifting it again. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A summer storm rolled hard over the ridge and pulled down a tree that had marked the corner of the field before anyone remembered who planted it. At the same hour, a story moved into the lane. The sisters had been heard speaking in the barn, and their voices sounded the same as when they were girls, and not as when they were wives. The brothers were said to have slept with knives near their heads. The elder matron was said to have told a stranger at her gate that the Lord himself had twisted the line for her, because men were too slow, and she was too old to wait for the law. The stranger said nothing and went on down the road and wrote nothing in any book that we have found. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The preacher who had pulled a page came by in daylight with his voice steadied and asked for his share of the harvest at the gate. The elder matron gave him a look that made his hands lift to their own shame and told him he could take his part when he named the names in the order God intended and did not falter. He rode away and returned after dark without coming near the house and spoke to the fence as if the fence had ears. He left a note rolled and tied with string that asked for mercy and used no names and asked for nothing else. The note was found months later in a beam under the eaves, where a bird had started a nest and thought better of it. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The order book admitted matters and refused others by tone. A line appears about a levy to repair a road washed by spring rains. Another grants an allowance for poor children kept by a cousin. Tucked between, a phrase about a complaint regarding improper burial is squeezed and then lost. Later, a line notes a bonfire believed to be accidental. The boys in town called the brothers poor stewards, even while their fathers paid them less for corn, as if the field were to blame for what men had done in kitchens. A barn burns in weather where lightning never touched. A hayrick goes hot at midnight. A lantern falls from a hand no one can name. Every justice gets to sleep as long as its bed is near someone who will say accident loud. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A hired boy from the next hollow, who had no interest in theology and plenty in girls, swore that he had seen a sight he would never speak of again. He said the younger sister walked into the spring up to her knees and stood while the older sister combed her hair with a wooden comb, and both women were silent. He said the water steamed around their legs and no breath lifted in the cold. He said he left and he did not run, because running is for men who wish to be followed. He said he married in the next county over because he did not want a wife whose breath had counted those women at the spring. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A boy who carried ash from the hearth noticed that the hearth stone felt like a chest at a wake when no body is laid in it. He pressed his hands against it to feel the pulse of the stone and could not sleep for 2 nights after. Another child, a girl with a good hand for needle, found a pin in the floor that had bent as if someone had forced a seam against a rule. She set it straight and it bent again in her lap. She folded it into the hem of her skirt and kept it there like a thorn. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A traveler noted that the household men had begun to sleep in places that were not their beds. He wrote with the smugness of a man who eats on credit in a county where no one knows him. He contrasted the tidy rows of tobacco with the slovenliness of a barn where hay had been scattered by a hand that did not know the first rule of arrangement. He missed the missing. He did not see the way the house had reassigned its persons into spaces their hearts had not chosen. He missed the way the elder matron turned the chair in the doorway each evening to catch the air before it entered. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The hollow began to speak in its own language. Dogs would not cross the yard line, even when the children they loved called them. The red bird nested far off. Vultures circled lower in a way that suggested they weighed not a carcass but a story. A widow 2 farms over confessed to her sister that she had heard a woman say numbers in her sleep and wake with a name in her mouth, and the name was not her husband's. She did not say which woman. The sister said a psalm and closed her own mouth with 2 fingers as if to tie it. What do you think? Leave your thoughts below. I read every theory. The road will give you one answer. The paper will give you another. The house will give you a third. That is only a wind through a room, and a kettle that will not breathe. When a certain subject arrives at the table, we can weigh them all and the scale will refuse to settle. Autumn again. A second midwife entry in tiny letters. Troublesome birth with grief. A margin note made months later in a different hand. The mother sick. The sister ill. The husband absent. No names. The infant ground near the fence gained no stone. The cedar ties frayed and fluttered like tongues the family could not teach to hold still. Children in the lane began to kick at their own shadows, as if a shadow might step out of its owner and walk to a different yard. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A neighbor with a kindly character derived from his habit of saving string brought cord for the elder matron to rehang the parlor sampler. She thanked him and did not invite him in. He stood at the door and saw inside a room that looked like any other polite room and thought nothing. Then he swallowed and felt something catch, as if a name had brushed his throat. He left the string on the step. Later he found a knot in the cord and could not remember tying it. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Brothers who had once hunted side by side began to carry different rifles and took different paths to the same tree line and did not shoot on the same day. The sound of 2 shots no longer marked the same meal. Women who had once baked in the same oven began to use different wood. One wood burned sweet. One burned sullen. Visitors tasted both and pretended not to taste. When asked directly, they said both loaves rose well. The answer did not please anyone. The house found small ways to correct what had been done. The latch stuck when an oath was about to be spoken across the threshold. The lamp burned higher when a lie tried to pass. The bed slats snapped when a man lay where sleep could not be called decent. Boards groaned under one sister and held firm under the other. No one wrote these things down because paper invites suggestion and suggestion brings shame. The house wrote them on itself. Even years later, when the roof had fallen and the stones had been carried for a spring house, the ground of that room rose a fraction higher than the rest. Boots scuffed there and felt the difference and paused. Sundays grew thinner. The family sat or they did not. If they did, no one asked after them, and the preacher kept his eyes on his book and lifted them only for a final sentence. Everyone would admit was kindly. The lines for the hymn flipped like fish in a pan, and then lay still. The congregation dispersed with their mouths like buttons. A man who ran the stand of nails outside the church door noticed that the family bought none the month the barn burned. He noticed, too, that their fence held up fine regardless. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Once a month the court read its little prayers in the square and trusted the county to nod. In one image that a boy drew with char on a board and sold for a penny at the fair, the judge's hands looked too small for his sleeves. The boy accidentally drew truth. Decisions were made by hands elsewhere. The real choices made in rooms where lamps burned late and air did not move. The bond on paper had done its work. It had pulled a shadow into the room and made it a guest who would not be eased out. The boy who drew laughed when told, and tossed the penny toward the gatherers of string. The final in this season is not a blow, it is a hush that does not lift. A year's last thunder passes overhead, and does not stop, and nobody runs to the door. The elder matron sits in the doorway with the chair turned again, and she holds a cloth above her lap, and her hands move, and do not move, and the cloth keeps its secret. The brothers move in the yard, like men whose legs belong to another place. The sisters walk in the house, as if every doorway had shifted half an inch to the left. The goats graze far and do not answer when called. The spring works and gives water. That looks like water and tastes like a story that the tongue would rather not tell. This is how the hollow remembers the event. Not with a single shout, but with a series of refusals. Air that would not breathe right. Fire that would not stay where it was placed. Water that took up copper without permission. Paper that would carry only initials. A rope that knotted itself in a pocket where no rope had been placed. A chair set against a doorway, as if flesh could guard what words had unguarded. The fields did not speak their curses for the sake of melodrama. They spoke for the sake of tali. The count had begun the night the preacher tied a knot wrong, and the elders believed the knot would hold. It held. It held against law and against prayer, and against the desire of those who had hoped it was their right to arrange God around their table. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. They said it was only a mistake of men and paper. A preacher on the move with rain in his coat and hunger in his eyes. A clerk with a baby sick at home and 2 bonds to write before dusk. They said the night blurred the line and the hand that signed did not mean to. The traveling minister took his fee without staring too hard at the names. The clerk filled the witness lines with marks that looked alike because the same tired man pressed both palms. When the sun rose, the deed felt different. Men choose the word error when they need the comfort that sin can be mended with a better pen. They brought that word into the kitchen and set it beside the kettle like a balm. It fed no one. It healed nothing. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Others chose a harder reason that allowed them to keep their hands clean. They said property must be kept in the right line. The elder matron had watched a husband die, and the world leaned toward taking. She had 2 daughters with no dowries that would tempt men who were not already kin. She held the deed in one hand and the girls in the other, and broke the old table with a look that said survival. This story excuses nothing and explains much. It sees a field as a mouth and a family as bread that must be kept from strangers with hungers of their own. It forgets what the land does when pressed this way. It forgets the taste of pennies in the spring. It forgets smoke that rises from under a house that is not burning. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. There was a gentler tale that spread where babies died often in mourning, looked like a dress worn thin. Milk sickness always finds blame if you let it. White snake root grows like any other plant, and does its harm without caring who drinks. The year of the vows was also a year of fevers that walked at night. Cows ate wrong, cream soared. Children coughed and did not stop. Women bled and no one knew why. This story takes the cedar sticks at the fence and lays them at the feet of fate. It says the yard would have had its little mounds, no matter who slept where. It asks us not to stitch scandal to ordinary grief. Then it forgets the cradle kept in the yard for a day and a night. It forgets the goat that would not cross a line in the dirt that goats had trod since kids. It forgets a sampler turned to face the wall. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Whispers blamed the preacher himself. You can punish a stranger without the wound stinging your own pride. They said he came from the river with 2 sacraments in his case and a bottle. They said he would have married a man to a fence post that night for the right coin. They said he tore a page from his journal and hid it in a beam because he did not like to see his own ink next to the names he had spoken together. A drunk man can be made to carry a town's sin until he drowns with it. Yet the lamp that smoked in that kitchen did not tilt in his hand alone. There were 4 hands that shook and 2 hands that wrote and 1 woman's eyes that did not look away. Blame can be poured into a jug and passed around. It does not quench thirst. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The Baptist minutes from that region waited a season, then scolded in their careful hand. They wrote that a certain household had brought confusion and offense. They wrote that discipline must be restored, and that example must be set. They did not write the names. They did not wish to put those letters under their own roof. A Methodist circuit rider's journal for that winter carries 3 blank days, where he had written a habit of noting how a kitchen felt, and whether people sang true. 3 blanks feel louder than any sermon. A Quaker friend downriver wrote to a cousin that kin had crossed into kin where it should not, and that these crossings make children who learn to hold their breath. Letters prefer the murmur that makes the writer look wiser than the scene they missed. The paper looks serious, while the house looks open-eyed and stubborn. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The law offered remedies that tasted like ash. A lawyer in town drew up a document that pretended to solve the puzzle by ink alone. He drafted a trust that placed the land under a cousin's name, so that the sisters became wards on paper, and not wives in the book that mattered to women. He promised that this would settle tongues and soothe heaven. He never brought his mother to the gate to test his plan. He never tasted the spring. He never stood in the kitchen and tried to say the names in the order the elder matron demanded. He set his fee and went home to a town that finds paper sufficient when bodies do not. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Another voice whispered theft of inheritance from a different line. A rival branch had expected to marry that land by the ordinary path and found the path blocked by kin too close. They brought the word suit into the court square and placed it on a bench, and fanned it like a fire that refused to take. They sought an annulment that would untie a knot that was never supposed to be tied. The clerk entered a line with initials only and folded the matter away. Years later, a barn from that rival branch burned in a dry month, and no one could say why. Men with good shirts shook their heads and said Providence, and meant vengeance with a Sunday hat on. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Some swore there is no need to reach east to find any old rite. They said the mountains had their own ways that were older than any parish rule. They said women in that hollow knew how to bind sickness to one circle by making that circle wrong. They said blue bottles on sticks along a lane catch breaths that would otherwise take children. They said cedar at a fence will hold a secret in the yard if it is tied with cloth and prayer. They said the elder matron counted degrees the way. She counted stitches, and then broke her count on purpose, so that what haunted them would stay home and not run through neighbors. They said the smoke under the sill was not smoke. They said it was the thing that had been asked to move out of the sleeping rooms, finding a different way into the house. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The county paper did what county papers do when a story is dangerous and also sells. It mocked first. It spoke of rumor and called people in the hollow excitable and simple. It praised the court for not encouraging slander. On the next page it printed a tale of a woman who fainted in church when the Book of Ruth was read too long. It never set the two pieces side by side with a line between them that said what everyone knew. In later years, a more ambitious sheet printed a reminiscence that named no names and called the matter a frontier curiosity. City readers nodded and thought themselves cleaner. In that hollow nobody read the piece, because nobody had the spare coin and nobody had the appetite. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A kinder version came from women who carried pails between their own doors and the spring. They said, do not turn a kitchen into a gallows. They said a family sometimes has only bad choices and picks one that hurts least that day. They said they had watched the elder matron keep too many people alive to deny her one sin that looked like love when the light was wrong. They said men had made rules that did not bend unless a woman broke them with her own body. They said, and here their voices grew thin, that you must pay for breaking a rule, even when you broke it to keep breathing. They looked at the ground when they said it. Their hands smelled of lye and milk and cedar. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The men at the rail spoke harder. They said the stain could not be washed. They said the corn would never set again on that field, and the dogs would never cross that yard. They said the boys in that house would grow with eyes too close together, and the girls would walk with their heads turned wrong. They liked the way fear felt on their tongues. They forgot how their own lines had crossed, where the old country had once demanded different. They forgot that every family has a stitch under the arm that does not match the rest of the seam. They forgot that the yard in question had carried their own dead up the hill more than once. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. There was a story of conspiracy that tried to explain away the missing leaves. The courthouse that burned in the next county took with it 2 years of minutes and a drawer of bonds and a packet of petitions. Men with dark imaginations saw men with darker coats pour lamp oil inside to clean what the county could no longer be bothered to hide. The more pious said lightning, the more practical said rats and dry timbers. The family in the hollow knew that whether fire was accident or plan, the smoke smelled the same. Their paper lived under cedar and a palm pressed into it, and left a print that outlasted ink. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A schoolmaster wrote a small history for a fair, and included a line about a scandal called the double knot. He drew a diagram that made degrees into a child's game with chalk, and wrote in the tidy hand he used for slates that rules existed, so that the young would not have to carry the weight of old sins. He did not say which young he meant. He sold his pamphlet for a penny and felt wise. His wife refused to let the paper into the house, and told him to keep his learning in his pocket. She had nursed a baby from that hollow, who would never be named, and did not care for chalk. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The men who loved doctrine argued the old tables with new heat. They pulled out Blackstone copied by hand from a copy copied by a cousin. They traced lines with a finger, and said you cannot fold this back on itself without making God a liar. Then the revival men pulled out experience and said God can touch what he wants and make right what men cannot. They waved the book of Ruth when it served and hid it when it did not. The women who could not choose between the two folded the linen, so the blood drops did not show, and set the book down, and told the men to eat and to hush. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. There was even a whisper that nothing had happened at all beyond the page, that the marriages were only a covenant for paper, and that beds did not share their breath, that it was a contrivance to keep land where a dying man wished it kept, and that no sin touched flesh beyond the sin of lying to the clerk. It is a comforting story because it cuts the thread between the vow and the cradle. It leaves the cedar sticks at the fence in the weather, where any wind might set them. It forgets the way the lamp leaned away from the vows in the moment when words were spoken. It forgets the sound that moved into the house that even a midwife did not wish to record in her neat hand. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. A man visited from a distance later and made himself a collector of curiosities. He wrote that he had seen a chest in a loft with 3 locks and a sampler turned to the wall, and he had heard a goat refuse a gate. He gathered these like pressed leaves and sent them east. The East replied with boredom and a suggestion that the mountain folk always embroider their stories this way, because it makes them feel significant. The collector returned to his better life. He never felt the spring taste of copper on his tongue. He never woke to the hum in the walls. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The children who grew there did not bother with theories. They learned rules. Do not count the cedar sticks aloud. Do not finish the rhyme about the redbird. Do not say the names in the wrong order. Do not drink from the spring until someone older has tasted it. They learned to stop at the fence and to lift their feet over it with care, as if the line itself had weight. Some left and broke the rules and found their mouths still stopping one word before the end in other counties. They came home in winters and stood at the gate and did not go in. They were not asked to. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. Time itself offered a kind of theory that required no words. The field produced in years, when the family kept to itself, and barely in years, when arguments rose in the yard. The goats did better when the elder matron sat at the threshold, and worse, when she fell ill and her chair stayed empty. The spring sweetened when the younger sister moved her bed, and soared when she moved it back. A house is a barometer for its own weather. People who live inside learn to read it. People who write their stories far away declare nature and move on. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. In a small book printed near the river, in the 1890s, a clergyman looked back across 60 years and wrote that he had refused to bless a union that the world called wicked. He wished the reader to believe that a righteous man can turn a county by saying no at the right door. The same book carries a footnote in a different hand that says the matter went forward anyway. The two sentences live together and cancel each other politely. The kitchen never read either line. It kept its own record in scars on wood and grooves, where a chair wore a threshold down. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. This is the chorus that grew in the hollow, and then in the county, and then in the state, and then wherever people wanted to make Kentucky a lesson. It changed with the teller, and always ended with a shrug that looked like certainty. The papers called it impropriety when they wished to be gentle, and lawlessness when they wished to sell. The court called it private, and moved the next matter along. The kin called it shame until they needed help, and then called it misfortune. The road called it bad luck. The women who kept the family alive called it survival, and did not spit when they said it. The preacher said burden in his book, and never read the entry aloud. Every version cancels another. Every version builds the same shadow. But not everyone agreed on what really happened. The cabin fell in a year when storms did not come, and no one expected the roof to go. Winds ran along the ridge and stayed polite, and still the shingles caved. The rafters sighed and leaned the way tired men lean, and the house took a long breath and set its weight on the ground, as if at last it could show the shape the years had made of it. When the smokehouse slanted and the loft floor slumped, the family was already gone, or so the valley said. No one came with a wagon to salvage much. The stones went a few at a time to a spring house near town. A hearthstone became a step where the banker's wife stood when she watered pinks. The parlor sill became a lintel over a corncrib. The ground under the kitchen remembered what the house forgot. It rose a finger's width higher than the rest of the yard, and kept that height for a long time. Boots scuffed there, and felt the lift, and men paused without looking down, and then hurried across and told themselves it was habit, and nothing more. The cedar markers at the fence rotted in weather. That was not cruel enough to explain the speed. Cloth kept its voice after the wood failed. It hung like a tongue that would not find its word, and then it tore and drifted, and caught on a thorn, and sang when wind found it. Someone set fieldstones without letters where the sticks had been. Children counted their steps between the stones, and forgot their numbers before they reached the gate. Dogs went wide, goats grazed in other fields. A cow broke her tether in the night, and was found at morning on the ridge looking down at the house, as if at a place that had never been raised by human hands. On certain days a thin white haze curled in the place the sill had been, and men said ground breath and left quickly, and put their hats back on too soon. Once a year a smell of warmed iron drifted up the path, and hung in the branches of the walnut. The spring did not sweeten right. Nothing flowed red or brown or strange. It looked like water. It tasted like a penny held too long between teeth. Those who came to the old yard for berries or for curiosity drank, and pretended to swallow, and let it go on their boots, and scolded their children not to waste good water, and then told the same children to hurry, and not step where the earth lifted. The court did not keep the year whole. 2 county books lost leaves at the same knot in the cord, and a third carried ink over names that no genealogy can raise again. Marriage pages for that time went thin. The edges of the binding wore a brown. The clerk blamed on tobacco juice, and the clerk's granddaughter blamed on rats. The man who worked the stove one winter day told a friend that paper will change its color around a word no one will say. He put the last ash into a brass pan and looked at his palm, and for a second could not tell if he was seeing the print of smoke or of wax, or of some other thing that wishes to be called God, and gets called law instead. In a cousin's trunk a Bible lies wrapped the way people wrap children who have fever. There are blood drops that have dried between Exodus and Psalms, and one-page puckers where a pin once held a lock of hair. A pressed flower cracks like a small bone when the leaf is turned and drops a speck that looks darker than a petal should look after years. The ledger hand that recorded weddings has a tremor like a man who holds too much in the wrist, and a careful reader sees a line begin and sees a second line run over the first, and sees the pen lifted as if a woman said stop. Someone touched cedar oil to the margin to keep the moths honest. It kept the moths honest. It did not keep the memory from leaning toward the truth when no one watched. The sampler that used to crown a verse in the parlor is now the thing children remember being turned toward the wall as if to teach it manners. 2 stitches in a corner do not match the others, and women who sue do not forgive that. They see the slip even when the cloth is gone. A docket slip exists somewhere and does not exist elsewhere, and calls a marriage improper, and then scratches the word until the paper thins and the light behind it shows through. The man who made the scratch used more strength than the word required, and his thumb left a crescent like a bruise in the fiber, and that crescent has outlived all the menders and all the preachers, and will likely outlive us. In the little church a bell rang an extra stroke at 3 funerals for people who never lived in that hollow, and the old women glanced at one another and tightened their shawls, and no one asked the bell rope why it had slipped. A rhyme learned in the yard went quiet for a generation, then came back on a summer night when a high school boy who liked to carve poetry into desks tapped it out with his knife, and a girl told him to hush, and his ears burned because her hush felt older than he was. Men who sell deeds now laugh when they hear the story, and their laughter sounds like papers folded too tight. They hold maps with our lines, and not the lines the land remembers, and tell themselves the right of way is permanent, and the way right is something that can be kept in a drawer. A survey crew staked the old plot one spring and found 5 stakes standing where 4 had been driven the day before. The men swore they knew their own work. The foreman swore he would fire the boy who had placed the extra, and then discovered no hand he paid had touched that corner. The 5th stake listed, and then righted, and then leaned again with no wind at all. The crew broke early. The next day the stakes matched the plan, and the foreman praised his own discipline and went home with a headache that measured itself in rows the way planters measure tobacco when it is time to set. Hunters claim the dogs will not cross the yard, even when the trail burns fresh. No one listens to hunters until they talk of good dogs that refuse duty, and then someone older looks up and nods, and calls the animal wise, and pours water in a cracked pan and leaves it by the gate. It is said the goats knelt once at the edge of the grass there in a dry month, and the sound they made was not the sound of beasts, and was not the sound of anything men want to hear in dark. Men looked away. Women looked without blinking. It is how tasks are divided in places like this, even when no one writes the division down. If you find the right drawer in the library in town, you will find an index card written by a hand that kept its letters thin and mean, and the card will say marriage book missing, and then say see also and list 2 towns that will give you nothing but sighs. In a larger room in Lexington, a box holds a family letter thick with words that do not say enough. Do not bring the children here in summer. The snakes are fat and the water is wrong. We will come when the frost takes the weeds and the men have sunk the new fence where the old one meant to stand. There is no signature, only a mark. The mark looks like a bird in the act of refusing a roof. The road down the hollow is still that road, if you look at it with the corner of your eye. You can walk it with your gaze set at the height where a child's face would show behind a shutter, and you will see nothing. You can lower your eye to the height of a cedar, not on a fence, and you will see a kind of crosswork in the weeds, where people once passed, keeping their feet light. You can kneel where the fence stood and smell old rope, when there is none. The senses keep what the mind throws out. The mind then comes back at night and begs to be let in. The story left the county and returned. It found its way into a genealogist's table and was made tidy by omission. 2 aunts become initials and then flourishes. A family line that once had a gate with a latch now has a hedge that cannot be pushed through. Society men in the 1890s printed charts with fine borders and dropped the sisters into the margin with a note that says name unknown and patted one another for the rescue. The rescue left a hole where the ground still lifts. A clergyman of the same time wrote a reminiscence that made himself brighter by saying he had refused a vow, and so saved a parish. A small hand in different ink added a note that said the matter went forward anyway, and then someone folded the page in a way that the crease sits on that line, as if to press it out of reading. People still talk and do not talk. Old men on porches call it bad luck, and tell boys not to bring curses home in their boots. Old women touch their throats when the tale comes near, and say survival with a tone that forbids argument. They keep the memory where milk and lie and seed are live, and do not yield it to opinions made of smoke. The valley holds its various truths, and lets the road carry only one at a time. You will hear the soft one first. A mistake on paper and the Lord forgives. If you linger you will be told the hard one. A choice to live, and it cost what it cost, and the land never forgot the weight of it. When rain moves off the ridge, and you stand where the door was, and no flies trouble you though the air is ripe, you can feel a small pressure against the chest. It is like a hand pressed there, politely by a person passing, who does not want to be pushed, and will not push unless pushed. You can speak aloud and use strong names, and you can make jokes. They turn to wire in the air, and hang between you and the walnut until you are too tired to keep your face a certain way. Then silence comes and stands with you and feels as if it will become a second body fitted inside, and everyone who has lived in a house like that knows what silence can do to a life that otherwise would have grown straight. There are people who move onto that ground from away and paint and plant and call their work renewal. They roast pork in the yard and tell stories about other haunted places and sleep on feather beds and wake in the morning without rest and look at their walls as if plaster can change expression. The children of such people often learn numbers they do not want. They count fence rails. They count steps. They stop at the same place on the same day each week and cannot say why the next number will not come. The parents tell the doctor the children need more air, and the doctor tells the parents their children are fine, and no one speaks of kitchens where chairs were turned toward thresholds for months at a time. If you put your ear to the ground by the fence on a still afternoon, you may hear something like the thin sound rope makes when it is pulled, and then released and then pulled again by a hand that cannot decide whether to keep the knot or undo it. That is a trick of imagination when told by a man who wants his dinner. It is a world speaking in the simplest way it can when the listener has earned no more. You can stand and tell yourself you heard water no nearer than the creek, and you can be right. You can also accept that the creek is just the voice the ground uses when it works at a problem it has promised to solve, and we will not like the solution if we stand too long to watch it. This is the shape the legacy took in the after years. A field that rises where a kitchen once stood. A church bell that sometimes adds its own step. A rhyme that rides down the generation and then pretends to be a game. A sampler that will never lie flat for any hand. A docket slip that abolishes a word by scraping it until light gets through. A wife who leaves the letter where no eye will read it and keeps it safe by pretending it matters only to cloth and cedar. A road that no longer needs a fence to tell passers-by they have stepped into a place that counts differently. Perhaps you will put your hand on a board in your own house and feel cool, where warmth should be, and lift it, and find nothing and feel in your palm a memory, as if paper has just been removed. Perhaps you will stand in a courthouse where 3 counties have pooled their ghosts and ask a clerk with a kind face for a book that no longer exists, and the clerk will tell you it went in the fire, and then you will see the clerk's fingers come together, as if to hold a corner of something that burns without ash. Perhaps you will sit in the reading room in Lexington and ask for a box that carries the wrong label and be given it because the staff are tired of the box, whispering certain dates when rain pushes against the windows. Perhaps you will find a pressed sprig of cedar that still carries a breath and a pin-pricked page and a hand that trembled when it wrote 2 names and then scraped them away until the feathered paper looked like frost after a warm night. Perhaps you will find the missing names if you dare open the archives yourself. Perhaps you will set your own ear to the ground and hear what those in the hollow have heard since the day a lamp smoked in a kitchen where a traveling preacher stood and pretended not to know what he was doing. Perhaps you will fail to choose a theory and learn to live with a field that never settles and a spring that keeps a taste and a bell that sometimes counts an extra life at a funeral and people who stop at 46 in their heads and never emit it out loud. If you want me to continue uncovering these buried histories, subscribe now and share your theory in the comments. Tell me where the fault lies. Tell me whether the 2 unions were error or hunger, or both together. Tell me whether you have stood at a fence and felt a yard watch you back. And when you count the steps home, stop before the last and listen for the red bird that refused a roof. It is still there. It knows the number you will not say,